Welcome to another edition of Who's Better Baseball. We have reached the quarter mark of the season, maybe just a little bit past it. And today we're going to reflect on what has been and what is coming in Major League Baseball. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein, joined by my co-host, Patrick Lyons. And we might as well say they might not fit into a big surprise of the season, which we'll get into in a minute, or a big disappointment so far this season. But when it comes to the past week, nothing has been more surprising than the Colorado Rockies. Got some winning baseball you got going on that you're covering day in, day out now. How about that?
It's been pretty unbelievable to think that over the first 5 weeks of the season, the Rockies had 7 wins. And now in the last week, they've matched that total. 7 in a row. Hottest team in baseball. Have not lost a game. They're the only team that hasn't lost a game since May 9th. Back-to-back sweeps. World Series champs Texas Rangers on the road in San Diego at Petco Park for the first time since 2013. Break up the Rockies. They're going to the World Series. No, they're not. They're not. But it's been fun.
It's man, that's the best part about baseball. It's just those swings of emotions that doesn't happen in other sports. We talked about it last week. Like you're not seeing that bottom dweller in football all of a sudden reel off 6 wins in a row in the NFL. It just doesn't work like that. I guess this would be the equivalent of maybe one big surprise on a Sunday, but you get to enjoy it for a whole week and it just keeps happening. And so a Rockies fan base can get a little bit of feel good for a while. So really cool to see that happen. And that's why we really can't take too much from any of the things we have seen through this first quarter of the season. But today is all about trying to figure it out. So let's start with the biggest disappointments at the quarter mark of the season. Who to you has been the biggest disappointment as a team?
Man, it's the Houston Astros. Look, the Houston Astros have been the biggest disappointment, not in any kind of way where I was hoping that they would do well. It's just you expect them to do incredibly well with the roster that they have. I know the starting pitching has been really banged up and they just haven't gotten the performances that they would have liked out of some of the guys in the back end of the rotation. Ronel Blanco, they've gotten more than expected from him. They won't in the next 10 days, of course, as he's been suspended for some sticky substances. But you just have to look at that roster and say they keep doing it year in, year out. And for the simple fact that they still have their core together, more than just a core as well. And for them to be struggling as much as they are, and the rumors that we're talking about, and in fact, they made a trade, I believe, just this past 24 hours. The Houston Astros have to top the list of teams that I'm little disappointed in how well they've been performing. How about you?
For me, it's interesting because I look at disappointments and I feel like a lot of the teams that aren't performing, we sort of expected that from them. And then there's teams that are still just caught in this middle ground where they can go either way, like the Rangers. Are they a disappointment? They probably should be better than one game over 500, but I don't think we're concerned that they're out of the race because they're right in the thick of it still. I would say the Blue Jays are a team that is really caught in this tough position right now. And it feels like they very much are trending in the wrong direction. But it doesn't always make sense because you look at that team and the collection of talent that they have, and you would think that they would be a much better club, and it just kind of continues to spiral for them.
The Orioles being 13 games over 500, they're as dominant, if not more dominant, I think, than anyone was expecting. But if the Orioles were just playing 500 ball on the nose, I don't think that would be a total surprise because, again, you're dealing with a young team. I think we've seen it many times where a club takes a huge step forward one year and then they fall backwards, come down to earth just a little bit, almost as a team-wide sophomore slump. Again, Orioles are matching those expectations, but the Blue Jays are right there. You know, they're only 4 games under 500. So you say they're about 500, but I think to your point, you look at their roster and you say, why aren't they more like the Philadelphia Phillies with that grouping of stars all throughout the roster, even in their rotation? Why aren't they having that kind of success rather than you win 1, you lose 1. You win 2, you lose 3. That's kind of how things are going in Toronto. And for that reason, they do have to be atop the list of the most disappointing teams this season.
You look at the Astros right now, who are a little bit worse than the Blue Jays. Their run differential is minus 17. It's not a drastic or as drastic as their win-loss record would suggest. The Blue Jays are minus 47. I mean, you look at the trends, and I don't know if it gets better. So to me, the Blue Jays are a team we're going to eventually get to who's going to be buyers, who's going to be sellers at the deadline. And they are in that position where I'm thinking it's closer to folding up shop than going for it this year. And when you have as many big contracts on their books and guys who are close to free agency, that's where all of a sudden we can look at the Blue Jays not just differently this year, but differently for potentially 3 to 5 years if they decide, you know what, it's rebuild time.
And especially because we're dealing with teams with windows of contention, and we know the Orioles window is wide open. It's not even a window now; it's a garage. There we go. I think I might have invented a term. But
I like that.
It's their garage door of opportunity because it's just wide open.
If you think about it, it's like a 3-car garage, I think. I think you got room for like both cars and then some stuff on the side, some storage. You know, you got stuff sitting away in Norfolk. Plenty of room to contend for a very long time in Baltimore. I like that. The garage of contention.
And I think in the backyard, they got room to put a little trailer, a little tiny home in the back. So count that if you would like for the Orioles. Whereas, again, the Blue Jays, we've talked about it so many times about Vlad Guerrero Jr. and Bo Bichette, those guys free agents at the end of next season. So their value is going to be worth a lot more now than in the offseason or at next year's trade deadline, because whatever team they potentially goes to is just not going to have them for quite as long. So with the Orioles being as good as they are and the Yankees just being as consistent as they are, same thing with the Rays. I think Boston's in that same kind of retooling process. It could allow the Blue Jays maybe to take a step back. Not a full rebuild. We've still yet to see what tanking 2.0 looks like. Everything with the new CBA has kind of prevented something like that happening with stockpiling draft picks and bonus pool money. But nevertheless, Toronto's employing a lot of really intelligent people that could allow them to maybe take a step back for the second half of 2024 and then retool to go a little bit more all in 2025, 2026 for a sort of new window of opportunity for them.
We're going to, as you kind of allude to there, like that decision you have to make. And obviously I look at some things from a Mets perspective, and we'll be talking about the trade deadline later. I think it's hard though. Once you start to concede a little bit, it's a lot easier to concede again. So they could say, all right, we got Vladdy, we got Bo, we're going to keep those guys. We're going to still go for it again in 2025. Maybe we sell off some pitching, build up the farm system, try to make some moves around the edges next year in the off season. Once you kind of wave the white flag once, it's a lot easier to do it again. And at some point, you don't want to be sitting in that worst place you can be in sports, in the middle too long. You want to make a move. And that actually brings me to another team that's been a disappointment that I think is maybe coming to that reality. It's the St. Louis Cardinals. The St. Louis Cardinals, now 2 years in a row of this, you got Goldschmidt and Arenado coming up soon, or at least for Goldschmidt, free agent after this year. Arenado, you wonder how many good years you have left. They're in a weird spot right now. And I don't know if they have it in them to have a big winning streak and get right back into the race.
It's rare for the Cardinals to be out of contention 2 years in a row. It happened for them in 2016 through 2018. But before that, you got to go back to the 90s where they were still really, really quality. So that Cardinals way is the thing that everyone talks about. And, the Rays, they've got their way of doing business and they've got their own way. We know the Dodgers are just pretty much good at everything. But the Cardinals were that first organization where it seemed as if they had a way of going about business and a way of blessing players by being in their organization and figuring things out and plugging and playing. And, the bloom is off the rose a little bit, especially when you look at all the former Cardinals outfielders that have had success elsewhere. And you say, man, Adolis Garcia, plugging that guy in the middle of our lineup, that'd been pretty nice. Randy Rosarena, that would have been pretty nice. And they just haven't had those guys. And their aircraft carriers, as you mentioned, Arenado and Goldschmidt, just haven't been really getting the job done. And they're on the wrong side of 30. Goldschmidt's a little closer to 40, more than anything. So they've got to figure out some things. And I don't know that they're going to figure it out fast because I think they are a long view kind of organization. It's just that the view has been really good for a while with this plug and place kind of situation that they've had going on. They're going to have to retool. They may have to rebuild and break things down. And then at that point, we'll really see if the Cardinals fans are the best fans in baseball.
Yeah, no, it's a weird comp, but as you were going through that, I was thinking about the Lakers after Kobe, before they got LeBron, like this period where you have this kind of historic franchise that's consistently winning, and then it's like the first couple years at the end of Kobe, where it's like that's not the Lakers anymore, and then it continues, and at a certain point, it's people might still show up to the venue because they love the team, but it becomes more about the ballpark and what the organization did stand for than what they look like now. And so you can't stack too many of these bad seasons on top of each other. I mean, the Cardinals did have a great year. The final season of Pujols and Yachty a couple years ago. It's not that far back, but man, if you have another rough year now and you break it all up, it could be a rough couple years. I think it's better though when you get to the other side of the hill to kind of race down it and then start that climb again. And I think that that'll hopefully make that window where you're out of it a lot shorter, which brings me to the Reds because they are climbing up the hill still. And we thought this was going to be a year that they were going to be able to actually contend in this wild card race. And look, as we're going to get to later, in the National League, everyone's in it basically, except for the Rockies and the Marlins. And the Rockies win 7 in a row, and now they're kind of in it in a weird way. So anything could happen, but man, the Reds have been going through it lately. And I'm curious your thoughts on if they could pull themselves out.
2-8 in their last 10, but going back to our previous conversation, -3 run differential. So it's been a little bit of bad luck. And if the Colorado Rockies can teach anyone anything, it's that sometimes when things are going bad, they're going really bad and you can't buy a win. And sometimes the opposite is true. And you just, you can't lose. And I think the Reds are going to be getting in that mold because you see some of the success that their players are having, and they're living up to those expectations. I mean, Ellie De La Cruz is still one of the best players, in all of baseball, despite the fact he's got Mike Ford batting behind him, third in the lineup, a quadruple A player, and no shade to Mike Ford, but he's a guy that bounces around and he's just kind of the 40th man on the 40-man roster. So for him to be behind him, Spencer Steer's a really quality bat that had one of the more underrated rookie seasons last year. And then after that, they're just not getting the contributions that they would have liked from some of their guys. The injuries have kind of impacted them. And I just don't think that they've really found their groove just yet. So while I would agree that they are probably one of the more disappointing teams this season, I have a little less concerns about them because I don't think it's all gone totally awry. I still see some hope and some silver linings for them in bouncing back here.
Well, that leads me to our next conversation here, and we'll talk about the biggest surprises of the quarter mark of the season a little bit later. We just talked about these two teams, Reds, Cardinals, so we might as well get into it. Who's better between these two? And I think we're both probably leaning the same direction. I look at this Reds team, and again, run differential is not everything, but it does paint a picture for us. The Reds are sitting -3 on the season. The Cardinals are sitting -50. So there's a pretty big gap there when it comes to what we've seen these teams put together. And for the Reds, I think there's been some really great signs when we look at the pitching side of it. Seeing Hunter Green, Nick Lodolo, seeing a rotation that's starting to form, this lineup is due to get so much better. And that's why I have confidence in this Reds team, because when they get some of these guys back, whether it be Marte off suspension and guys coming off injuries, maybe they can start to click into form and bring back some of that magic from last year.
The Reds absolutely are the team that have more coming from behind, filling in those holes, players that are injured that should come back and really make an impact. You look at the full standings and you see the home road record, and they're very similar between the Reds and the Cardinals. But against teams that are 500 or better, the Reds are 6-13. Again, not great. That's just under a 1 out of every 3 games you're winning there. But the Cardinals 3-11. So they're really just getting brutalized a little bit. So the Reds losing out on these close games. I think the Reds are that team where, again, they've got more on the upswing, and they're not going to be sellers in the same way that you could see the Cardinals. Now, does that mean if there's an expiring contract or two on the Reds, maybe a reliever? They're so young, they don't really have very many expiring contracts, but they're not going to get as wild at the trade deadline whereas the Cardinals, they got to make a real big decision. I don't think you would trade both Arenado and Goldschmidt. Arenado still has several more years left. He's a quiet leader. He's not one of those really, really loud guys that, you're going to want all the young players on the roster to follow after. And he's just quiet. He's more subdued in that way. So I don't think we would see both of those guys, but Goldschmidt is definitely the best player on either of these these teams that you could see get traded at the deadline. And once that happens, Cardinals are going to go downhill, whereas the Reds still have plenty to play for. These young guys have a lot to prove. So even if they're out of it, they're going to be going hard. They're going to be gung-ho the entire way for the duration of the 162-game season.
Yeah, they are for sure. And the Cardinals are in an interesting spot with Goldschmidt because he's been so bad. That's part of the reason why they've struggled. So it's hard to trade a guy that's in that position, but he is the piece that you would look at and say, all right, like he could get you something. And he's the guy to move because he's probably on his way out. What they really need is, for one, him to be better so that they can be better, but they need him to at least give them that opportunity at the trade deadline, because at this point he's just not performing. And I think the Cardinals, they have a lot of good players, and we look at this core and we say, okay, like you talk yourselves into it every single offseason that they have enough. And the only question was the pitching. Their pitching's been okay, but man, they are not scoring runs at all. And I think the Reds are a team that also is not scoring, but I understand it more with them. Like you see the names missing in the lineup. The Cardinals, the names are there. They're just not doing anything.
It's true. And I think in this conversation of, hey, who's going to be contending first, or who's better, and if you're trying to figure out what's going to happen the rest of 2024 or even beyond, I think the younger players on the Reds roster have more of an impact than the Cardinals, because with the Cards, even if they were to turn around and trade some of their bigger pieces, who is their cornerstone guy? Who is their young player that you can look to and build around? We know that Elly De La Cruz is that player. Spencer Steer, very underrated. Hunter Green is a frontline starter. Andrew Abbott, also really underrated. There are those players that are solid for the Cardinals. If you're looking at Lars Nootbaar or Nolan Gorman, Brendan Donovan, Mason Wynn would maybe be that guy, but he's still yet to establish themselves. They just don't have those same young players that can make an impact. And so that's kind of the worry. Now, the Cardinals did lose Wilson Contreras. That was a gruesome injury. I don't know if he's able to even possibly come back by the end of the year. Steven Matz, he's not moving the needle that much. Tommy Edman has had wrist surgery, so he's been missing some time. But even still, I think the bench pieces, the depth pieces for the Reds have played a little bit better than who the Cards have coming up next in the system.
Yeah, no, they have for sure. And I think a huge separator that you mentioned there was the Mason Wynn, Elly De La Cruz angle of it, right? Like, look, there's nothing wrong with Mason Wynn being your shortstop of the future. Looks great defensively. He's hitting 280 right now. Like, you can't ask for much more out of a young player. But Elly De La Cruz has 26 stolen bases. I mean, Elly De La Cruz has 9 home runs. There's a certain level of just box office status that Elly De La Cruz provides your ball club that lifts you up. And it also is going to keep some fans in that ballpark too throughout this season. If you're a Cardinals fan, what's got you going to the ballpark right now? You want to watch Lance Lynn pitch? I mean, there's just not a lot there that if I was a Cardinals fan, I'd be like, yeah, man, I know, yeah, it hasn't been the year we've wanted, but I love watching this team and seeing where they're going to go. At least with the Reds, you can watch Elly De La Cruz each game and buy into, well, there's a bright future because we have that guy.
Reds are on the come up. Cardinals are not. Cards had that excitement at the beginning of last year of an impact young player in Jordan Walker, and that never really came to fruition, unfortunately, right? Matthew Liberatore is now up with the Cards rotation, so maybe there's something there. But again, as you pointed out, it's not the same excitement factor as an Elly De La Cruz, and even some of these younger guys where you're looking to say, is Noelvi Marte going to be that player once he comes back from his suspension? There's a ton of those players that you could look at and say, there can be some retooling that happens. If Jonathan India ends up getting traded at the deadline because of the glut of those infielders with Elly and Noelvi Marte and Matt McClain when he comes back from injury, you can still get a little bit creative and trade a Jonathan India and then add somebody maybe to the middle of your rotation. So you can add by subtracting in that way. Whereas the Cardinals, they just have to choose that direction of, hey, maybe our guys can figure it out and maybe we sneak in with 83 wins and a lot of really good luck, or we just really have to start tearing this thing down.
Yeah, it's man, these decisions in the middle of these seasons become so tough. And I just I like the options that the Reds have. I like the between just the internal guys that are going to come back, between being able to look at, all right, you have some overlap at some positions. So if you wanted to get creative at the deadline and trade from an area of strength and get an arm if you needed to, whatever it ends up being, I just think the Reds are going to be the better team throughout this season. And I really look at this Cardinals team and I almost say, I think the Cardinals are more in the Pirates league right now than the Reds. I feel like the Reds should be the third best team in this division that's in the wild card race this year. I don't believe those other two are going to be in this one.
I would agree. We've seen enough of those other teams to have those worries where sure the Reds are not performing right now, but you have a lot of confidence that they will. In our chat, Grin aside with a little cheeky comment there, tongue in cheek, with the Cards, you get to be part of a great, kind, wonderful fan base. I don't know, Ryan, is that enough for you to go to the ballpark? Just the community vibe?
Well, I mean, look at his next comment. I mean, I don't think that's getting any of us to the ballpark. Yeah, look, it's bad times right now in St. Louis, and I don't think it's getting better. And I'd actually like to carry them and this conversation into our next one about the trade deadline. We'll talk about the biggest surprises at the quarter mark as we talk through each league, but I want to start in the National League here and look at the race because it's pretty clearly divided right now, right? You got Phillies, Dodgers, Braves. That's the top tier. And then the Brewers and the Cubs are kind of hanging in it, where as much as we wanted to talk about the Brewers as a team that could sell this year, and boy, did they have pieces that could go and could bring back something. You're in first place. You're in this race. There's no reason for them to fold up shop at all. So I think the Brewers are squarely buyers, and I think the rest of those teams are as well. I can't see any of those teams, those five, falling out of this. And I feel like to me, this really is a league where there is one playoff spot that should be up for grabs. And then the only other thing to decide is who's going to win the division. So the Braves or the Phillies going to win? Are the Cubs or the Brewers going to win? But I feel like this division, or this league, I should say, is really just going to come down to a single spot.
It really will, and with the NL Central, it's been good baseball. We've kind of had that thought that it's only gonna be one team, and there's still plenty of baseball left, right? We know the Diamondbacks have had a ton of injuries, so they might play up a little bit right now as they're technically tied for the third spot in the wild card. Nationals are playing a little bit over their head. Giants, Reds, I think we could see both those teams getting into it. But it is interesting how the teams that we expected to be there in any no particular order are kind of there, and it could be a bit of a runaway. Like you said, the Brewers could really be safe. The biggest question, I think, is did the Brewers learn something from trading Josh Hader in 2022? Did they say that, well, we were still able to bring in some really good pieces and stay competitive when we traded Hader, and we still got Rogers to be our closer, Esteury Ruiz, Robert Gasser, who's now been fantastic in his 2 starts with the Brewers? Or do you look at it as, well, they did miss the postseason that year. If you had Josh Hader, you might not have had to worry about that. But now you're set up better for the future. So that's the question is now that time, is talking about windows of contention, is this the time where they maybe need to go a little bit more all in? Or are they going to have that approach of, you know what, we need to be a little bit concerned about tomorrow. We need to be just as concerned about the future as we do this season. So maybe we are going to offload a Willy Adames.
That's exactly where I was going to go with it. It's funny that you mentioned, like, it's almost not only just did they learn their lesson, it's what lesson did they learn? Because in some respects you could say, yeah, you blew that season, but in the long haul, it was the right move for the franchise to make. So it is a very tough decision that the Brewers are the one team of those five that I circled and say, we can't just count them out from potentially selling just yet. And Adames is the guy. It's funny, actually, Devin Williams is another one where maybe if he gets healthy and shows you a couple innings right before the deadline, that's one that you could quietly move. And he wasn't there for most of the year, and it might not upset the apple cart as much as the Josh Hader trade did. But Willy Adames is playing good baseball. And he's a huge part of what they're doing. As much as you can look at Joey Ortiz and say, all right, they got a shortstop ready to go, fill in that spot. Joey Ortiz isn't going to replace the production of Adames in that lineup. He's already part of your lineup. So, yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. What value do you place on the return you could get for Adames? And do you cash it in, or do you just say, you know what, we're going to ride this thing out, get the comp pick, and maybe we go on a run this year in the playoffs?
And the biggest difference, I think, between 2022 and now is David Stearns isn't there. So if David Stearns was the one who made that decision because he's comfortable in his job and he's not necessarily trying to win a division every single year at all costs, he's thinking of the future of his company, right, of his team. But now you got some new management there in place, or rather, everyone just kind of moved up the chain from the organization, and so it will be interesting to see exactly as you said, what's the lesson that they learned from the Josh Hader trade. Since on one hand it didn't work out for them in that season, but since then it has absolutely worked out. Getting Esteury Ruiz and then trading him in the big Sean Murphy, William Contreras deal. So that definitely helped the organization more, I think, in the grand scheme of things than it hurt them.
It's a really tough give and take when you're that small market team trying to decide which way to go with it. And there's a lot of these teams that are caught in the middle. I think if we looked at the clear sellers, with all apologies to the Rockies, we imagine that they're going to sell whatever they can. Same thing with the Marlins. I mean, they are clearly sellers at this point. They already indicated that they've already started selling. So we know where those teams lie. But what's fascinating to me, we've talked about Reds Cardinals today. You got Reds, Cardinals, Pirates, Giants, Mets, Nationals, Diamondbacks, and Padres all separated within 2.5 games right now. That's what we're talking about this third wildcard spot. It's really anyone's. When it comes to a team that I just don't think is going to sell under pretty much any circumstance, the Padres are the first one that jumps to mind as a team that is pretty all in. Because last year they didn't sell, so I feel like they're going to follow on that, and they're probably going to buy again too.
Yeah, they already bought Luis Ariz, so we know they're in the game for that. They could, going back to what we were saying about the Brewers with AJ Preller, he could be looking to mix and match and really treating this franchise as he has for the entire decade, like a fantasy baseball team. Like, all right, you know what? I'm going to make this deal because it's a good trade. It makes my team a little bit worse right now in the present for the next week or so, but I've got some other things on the back burner. And in the grand scheme of it all, I think my team will be better after I make these 2 trades. We just don't really see general managers operating in that way. I think a lot of that just has to do with the changing chemistry within a clubhouse and maybe mixed messages that are sent to the players. If you're adding to go all in and then underperforming, and then you're trading away before acquiring again, it can just be really complicated and difficult really to get the players to mesh well. And so when you tinker with that kind of chemistry, it can be really hard, and it's probably best done in the off season, which is where AJ Preller did a little of that mixing and matching, getting rid of Juan Soto, but then also bringing in Dylan Cease. I don't know that we're going to see after the arrival of Luis Ariz now selling off maybe a player or two, especially because most of their best players and their biggest assets, they're signed long-term deals.
Yeah, I don't know how they could sell. I don't like. Hey, Sung Kim is the one guy where it's like, all right, free agency, you can deal him, but then, and granted, yes, they have like 7 shortstops they could.
Who's going to play
there.
short? That was my question. I was like, you can't trade Ha-Seong Kim. Who's going to play shortstop?
Yeah, maybe you move Bogarts then Ariz can bat. Maybe that's it. Like that would be, I guess, the trade. It would be trade Kim, slide Bogarts back to short, put Ariz at second, and then trade for XDH. That might be a rental DH, might cost you 25 cents on the dollar. So you sell Kim at 125 cents and you mix it all together. But overall, I think they're going to be in the race, and I think that they're going to be hesitant to remove much from their roster. These other teams, let's go through them and just kind of talk it out as far as buy or sell. We'll go right down the line. Diamondbacks coming off a pennant. I feel like they're a team that doesn't necessarily sell, but probably doesn't have to buy much either. It feels like they're just waiting for their guys in house to click.
They already have their pieces. They just need them to be healthy. As you said, they just need them, those players, to click. And then you have to decide, like, do you want to invest a little bit more in this? I think the Diamondbacks are just in such a good spot with all of their young players who still aren't even arbitration eligible, that it could allow you to say, you know what, maybe this isn't working out. And a player on a 1-year deal like a Jock Peterson or Randall Grichuk, you know what, we will go ahead and offload that player, bring back a little bit something that helps us retool. And hey, boom, we can plug Jake McCarthy in, who's playing really well. So I think it allows them to play it up as best as possible, have the best of both worlds in many ways. So the Diamondbacks are a team that I don't think will be doing any major selling. They may have to get creative when it comes to their future, but I don't really see them going heavy in one direction or the other.
No, I don't either. And so we have kind of two teams in a somewhat similar bucket that are in the same division that are vying for the same spot. And I think if I had to predict right now where that second wild card, or I guess the third wild card is coming from, but the one that's up for grabs, I think I'd lean NL West with those two teams. But you really never know. And I guess the Giants also part of that equation. The Nationals have gotten off to a pretty good start this year. They've gotten ridiculous performance out of their pitching staff so far. We had an article go up this week about it. To me, it's a team that should not buy into the fool's gold of this season. This is your last sell, in my opinion. Get what you can because the core is coming. Keep the pieces that are around long term. Don't go trading a pitcher that has 3 or 4 years of control that could be a fixture for you. But like Trevor Williams, sell that guy. I think he's in the second year of a 2-year contract. Get something for it because he's been great this season. And they still will have an excited second half because they have so many young players coming up. We could see James Wood any day now. And just being able to watch James Wood and CJ Abrams from the Juan Soto trade in the same lineup, if you're a Nationals fan, like that rebuild didn't hurt that bad, did it? It was a couple years, but man, they could be good again very soon. And they've already been a nice surprise so far. They would have been one of our biggest surprises too.
The Washington Nationals are so interesting right now because it's going to be a while before we see them make a decision. And sure, it seems like the most obvious one is to trade away those veterans. But right now, you do have this young core that is performing. And I think you want to reward that. So they may have to wait until that last minute before they decide, are we buyers or are we sellers? I think if they do end up becoming buyers, it won't be anything major. Randall Grichuk, he's getting a lot of play. His ears are ringing right now, wherever he's at in the world, because he feels like a perfect fit for this team where you trade maybe your number 3 starter in Double-A to the Arizona Diamondbacks, and you bring in a little bit veteran presence and say, hey, look, we're rewarding you. We're adding to this roster. We're trying to make it a little bit better. A guy who can go do it on both sides of the ball, where he can pick it out in center field. He's got some range, but he's also got a little bit of power in his bat as well. So the Nationals are so interesting to see how they're going to behave. But I think they could be the longest. They could be the biggest holdout before we figure out what it is their plan is going to be.
Man, because you're right in the sense that absolutely, like you have a young team that is showing up to the ballpark and it is given you a pretty exciting season so far. You don't want to just blow it up on them, but I feel like you also have to, I think it comes down to having a GM like Mike Rizzo that's been there forever that allows them to do the responsible thing. And you ultimately have to articulate to those guys, listen, as much as Trevor Williams and Jesse Winker have been a big part of what you've done this year, let's bring up whatever kid in AAA is throwing the ball well and have James Wood take those at bats. So we're building to the future and we're going to get 2 or 3 more pieces. They're going to help you guys when you're really ready to win in 2025, 2026. But look, if they keep on playing well and they're sitting 4 or 5 games over 500 at the deadline, you might be in a position where you say, you know what, let's ride it out. Let's see if we make it. And it is what it is if we don't get some of those prospects back. But I feel like they're a team that should still sell. Like you said, they'll probably sit on the fence for a while.
Yeah, they've got Eddie Rosario as one of those expiring contracts, Jesse Winker, Dylan Floro. Joey Gallo, who there's an option for the next year, but I don't know that'll happen. Victor Robles, believe it or not, it feels like he's still this prospect you're waiting to happen. And then there's still about 10 other players that are going to be free agents after 2025. They got one more year of arbitration. So, Kyle Finnegan closing out games late. Boom, maybe he is a guy that goes in and gets traded. So I think they could have an opportunity to be aggressive. And, our buddies in the chat, Grinaside and Randall, talking about, some closers and teams that could use a little bit of that boost. Kyle Finnegan, I think, could boost a lot of teams' bullpen, but I think the Nats are probably going to be a little more conservative. And it's not an over the top, conservative, just let's wait and see what happens, because we don't want to totally take the wind out of the sails of all these young guys that are performing well. So let's not be aggressive like an A's, who we might get to in a little bit. If they were to trade someone like Mason Miller, I think the Nats are going to kind of sit tight. And then from there, they could get really creative with all the names that we've just said that are about to be free agents in the next 18 months.
I think the market ultimately tells you so much. And last year, there was a couple teams that saw a seller's market where they could get a lot and say, you know what, we're leaning into it. The Cardinals, the Mets, the White Sox. And you look back in retrospect, those are the teams that sort of did the best at the deadline. And particularly look at the White Sox and the Mets. Their farm systems have just skyrocketed in value around the league, where they were kind of bottom third, and now they're pushing towards top third farm systems, thanks in large part to beating sellers at the deadline. So that brings me to my Mets here. And Steve Cohen yesterday kind of let us into his brain a little bit. He, sometimes you got to get that phone away from Steve when it comes to Twitter. And so there was a blogger that wrote an article about blowing it up. And Steve Cohen basically said, all in the future, we can't really do anything until the trade deadline. Now today, they have gone spin zone on it. Oh no, I meant that we might add at the deadline, or I still 100% believe we're going to make the playoffs. Look, if the Mets are not in the race, they will sell. If the Mets are in the race, I don't know if they'll buy. To me, that's the distinction on the New York Mets right now. I think if they're in the race, they might just hold their chips and let it play out because they want their fan base to enjoy the season. But I'll tell you something. If the Mets are sitting at 4 games under 500 at the trade deadline like they are right now, they're going to be making moves. They're going to be selling pieces. And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some creative bookkeeping again. Starling Marte doesn't look like a player that would attract much. But if you eat his contract and you can sell Starling Marte to a team where it's like, hey, you get Marte for the rest of this season and you only have to pay him $5 million next year to be on your team, you might get something. So watch out for the Mets. There is a real possibility they are one of the biggest sellers yet again.
That's one of the biggest strengths of the Mets is just finances, right? It's also true of the Dodgers. If you want to eat a contract or pay down a player's salary, then you're going to get a much better prospect, and you're buying prospects. And we know that is a system that works in MLB that not every team can utilize. So for the Mets to be able to do something like that, that's great. That's perfect. It will be interesting to see what that magic number is for a team like the Mets. I think it's probably different for every team in their cycle of window, if you will, where 4 games under for one team, hey, we might need to add a small piece. Because again, a sort of fourth outfielder type, or a guy that's a number 5 starter in your rotation, or a guy that's more of a 6th or 7th inning arm, just because you need a body and you want to send a message to the roster and the fans, it's not really going to cost you that much, especially when you're looking at an organization that's got, close to 200 players in the minors. Hey, you know what? This guy is expendable to us. He's got value to this other team, but we can go ahead and get rid of this arm from AA or high A. And so you can still, have your cake and eat it too, and look like you're buyers when really you didn't buy very much, right? So
yeah,
4 games under 500, I think that's a pretty good number for the Mets.
I put a poll out today with my other show, Locked On Mets, and I said, what would you rather have? This is a poll to the fan base. The Mets are 5 games over 500 at the trade deadline, and in the mix for the wild card, or they're 5 games under and they're gearing up for another mass sell-off. You know what the results of that poll were?
No, what?
60-40, the Mets fans preferring them to sell.
Wow.
So, and look, I did my whole show today for Locked On Mets was saying, look, you can't give up on this team now. It's too early. You're a quarter of the way into the year. See what happens. But You know what? I can understand a fan base that doesn't want to be in the middle and wants to see, like, all right, if the Mets decided to sell, Luis Severino's pitching really well right now. He's probably not part of your future. He's on a 1-year deal. What can you get for him? JD Martinez is a contract that has, most of the money deferred. So they don't have to eat much. It's like a $2 million deal for other teams that would trade for it. JD Martinez as a bat that you can sell. Like, there are a lot of pieces that can go. Even look, we got the comment here, just some of the pieces that
Chat's
can,
all over it. And the chat
yeah.
also asking, and I'll ask it of you, Ryan. Pete Alonso, are you trading him? Are you holding on to him? Because you're going to at least give him a qualifying offer. So you're going to get a compensation pick, which has a certain amount of value. And at least you get him to the end of the season. And maybe it provides a little bit of hope that the polar bear can stay in the blue and orange of the Mets. Or do you just have to deal the guy and wish the best for him? You can still sign him in the offseason after you trade him, but that's probably not going to happen if you do.
As someone that believed the Mets were going to re-sign Jacob deGrom until the very end, even though all the signs pointed towards the opposite, as a fan, I'll be honest, I can't remove my heart from it sometimes. And I see Pete Alonso coming up on the home run list, and I want to see him pass Strawberry. I want to see him wear a Mets uniform. We'll know the Mets, especially if they're out of it. I think if they're in it, they'll say, all right, let's just ride this thing out. But if they're out of it or they're close, we'll know if the Mets want to sign him by what they do at the deadline. Because if they don't have any intention to sign him, they will trade him, because it's much better to do it now to your fan base, to make that break, to get something for him, and to sort of make it known, than to not make that declaration, let it play out, continue to will they, won't they for more months. If you just sell him, you cut the ties. You say, Pete Alonso is not our future first baseman. You have Mark Vientos on the big league roster that could be your first baseman. You have other prospects coming, and it's the easiest position to fill, moving forward. So we'll see. Personally, like I said, I can't remove my heart from it. I think he's going to stay with the Mets and he's going to sign in the offseason. But that if I was to be more objective on it, anything is in the cards.
This is going to be painful for you to answer, but you got to do it. We're here. We're alive. The chat wants to know, what team could you see Pete Alonso excelling on? Like, what does the man behind all of that clear or white polar bear fur? Polar bear fur is actually clear, apparently. I don't know if you know that. Anywho, but the point is, Pete Alonso on like another roster, and you're like, oh man, I could see him going off for the final 2 months of the season, and he might be a great fit. It's painful, but I need to know, Pete Alonso, what team?
The Cubs are the one that always just comes to mind, and there was a little bit of that chatter a couple of times. Is it real? Is it not? Is it just another big media market that will pump that out there? But I can just see, look, Pete Alonso day games at Wrigley in a playoff chase, hitting home runs. Like, I can envision it. I can see it. And I think that'd be a team that could be a long-term fit. Now they have some answers right now at first base already, getting Michael Busch, and they've had Mervis up, but I mean, Pete Alonso is a different level for them, and whether they DH'd him, played him at first, whatever it was, you plug him in the middle of that lineup, that would be a huge move that would allow the Cubs to maybe grab that division from the Brewers when it's all said and done this year, and then potentially sign him too.
Breaking windows at Wrigley Field and breaking hearts in the process. Michael Busch for Pete Alonso, straight up. It's an odd one, but again, we're talking about 6 years of service time for Michael Busch and 2 months of a rental of Pete Alonso. Would you do that?
You know what? I'd have to watch more Michael Busch to exactly know what I'm getting, to say for sure. On the surface, I would say, look, if he's a big leaguer that you're getting a ton of control over, you would think that if you were just to put it in like a trade value machine, the Mets are getting the better end of that. This is a couple months of Pete Alonso. For me, would I do it? No, because I still think that I think if the Mets let this thing play out, I really do. I think Pete Alonso is going to go into the market. He's not going to get what he maybe expected. And I think they can come to terms on a contract that allows Pete Alonso to be a big part of the Mets moving forward without having to pay him excess of $25+ million. I think he'll settle in. Nemo's getting like 20.25 million a year. I think Pete might settle in around that number, and it might make more sense to continue to build around him. But again, is that a fair trade? I mean, from a Mets perspective, absolutely. I'm sure there's Cubs fans that would say, "No way, I'm not giving up Bush for Alonso." Though that's the fun part of all this.
It is. Oh man, that's I love the back and forth. I love the speculation. It makes me think. And look, Elias Diaz last year was the MVP of the All-Star game, and there's a lot of people who believe, including myself, he wasn't traded at the deadline because he was the MVP of that game and because of the so-called message it would have sent to fans. Oh no, you couldn't possibly trade this guy, or we need him to be on the cover of our media guide, which didn't end up happening. I was wrong about that. But if Pete Alonso were to go out and win the home run derby this summer in Texas for the third time, would that somehow potentially make it harder to trade him? It would make him even
No,
more beloved.
I don't think so. I don't think. I think it's going to be tough to trade him no matter what happens. Yeah, I think I don't know if that'll change. I don't know if he's going to do it. I kind of wish he would. I feel like he already has shined in that derby enough that he should pass the baton off to other guys. But yeah, I think for if the Mets trade Pete Alonso, there's going to be a portion of the fan base that is just frustrated with this season. I'm seeing all the time. There's people every day that are telling me in comments to trade Lindor, Alonso, Nimmo, like just clear like that. That's New York sports fans for you.
Yes.
But there is a large portion of the fan base that no matter what happens before it or after it, when there is that severing of ties, if it happens, it's going to suck for fans regardless. And I guess the only positive side of this is if Alonso is the one big bat that can move at this deadline, where you get whatever team it is that is aggressively trying to win, that gives you the offer that makes it all better. Because last year, fans weren't necessarily thrilled that Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer got traded, but when you saw the return, you stepped back and said, "Well, the Mets did the right thing for the franchise long term." And I think that's what it might happen. What might happen again here this year?
And the fans weren't emotionally attached to either of those guys,
It's not
right?
the same way.
It's
Not the same
definitely
way.
not the same way. The heartstrings aren't being tugged like it is for Pete Alonso. And like you said, with just how wild Mets fans can be. And shout out to my cousin Jordan, because still when we text back and forth, if Brett Beatty makes a bad play, DFA Beatty, like that's the immediate text he sends, because those were the literal things that were being discussed, I think, when he came up in 2022. And you're like, designate him for assignment, like literally, like just give him up for nothing.
Yeah, no.
That's how quickly you're quitting on him. So we'll be hearing more about what it's like. DFA Beatty, cousin Jordan, Mets fans, you guys are crazy, but I do love you.
I just want to let cousin Jordan know Brett Beatty has options. Okay, you can just change the text, send him to AAA. That's actually a viable one because
Okay.
I can see it happening. But yeah, you don't have to DFA the guy. I mean, that's a little bit of a careless use of some resources on a guy that was a top 20 prospect a couple years ago. Let's move off the Mets to some of the other teams here that are caught right in this middle ground. The Giants are the next one that's really crazy to me, really fascinating, because I don't know what they would sell. They bought in an interesting way. The pieces that they bought have not performed at all. Chapman, Soler, Snell. We were hyping up what they did, and man, it fell flat. And they're kind of similar to the Cardinals, right? They're caught in the middle, and they can't really get back to their former glory.
Yeah, it's strange. I think they're in a very unique situation, as you stated, because they brought in all of these free agents, but most of them were on short-term deals. And so they're not tied up with these players and say, hey, this is our core. It was more of, this is our flavoring for right now. This is the topping to our pizza. So if we happen to swap something out, we can maybe bring back somebody, next off season. I mean, Matt Chapman could be a free agent after this season. He's got a player option. Blake Snell, it's been rough going for him already, but he has a player option. So you could turn around and trade those guys, because you're not really beholden to them in the same way you are to a Jung Hoo Lee, who they've got no intention of trading, a Robbie Ray, who they also just got and don't have that same connection with, but he's got 3 more years left, 2 more after this season. But you believe that he's going to be a critical part of the rotation going forward. Michael Conforto is a free agent after this year. So I think it could allow you to do maybe not a soft rebuild, but it could allow you to be, somewhat more aggressive at the trade deadline. They're the team that I think you're going to see maybe bigger names or slightly more surprising moves out of than the other 2 teams in the NL West that are vying for a wild card spot in the Padres and Diamondbacks.
They're definitely the one that it just feels like the battle uphill is too much for them to actually get there. And yeah, take advantage of it. And I feel like there's some teams that are more willing to do that, others who aren't. I don't typically remember the Giants selling in the past. They kind of just sit on their hands for the most part, or they buy if they're in it. But yeah, I think they should be sellers. And kind of going through the rest of this here, the Pirates, I mean, what do you sell? They're at the point of rebuild where a lot of their guys are around long term. And honestly, I think they're set up for a great summer of just 2 out of every 5 days. You get to watch Jared Jones and Skeens going up and blowing guys away. You might only see 60 pitches on different starts, but you're going to see them, and that's going to give you a promise into the future. And then the Reds and the Cardinals, we've already kind of talked about. This is a National League race where a lot of teams are in it and will stay in it. And I don't know who exactly is going to sell. We've been talking for a while, so I want to move to the American League as we get close to approaching on an hour on this stream. We haven't broached the American League at all. What's fascinating with this league is you have the Royals, the Twins, the Guardians, 3 teams that we didn't really know what they were going to be that have really performed rather well so far. Could the Central have 3 playoff teams? I want to start there because right now today they would have 3 playoff teams, and absolutely nobody ever would have thought that the AL Central could be represented by 3 teams in the playoffs this year.
Except maybe us, because we talked a lot at the start of the season, even before the season began, about how competitive both Central divisions were going to be this year based on the moves that they had made. More quiet moves, but enough where if the pieces fit together as we had expected that they might, you could be looking at more than just win the division, you're in, no wild cards. With the 3 teams, 2 wild cards in the AL Central right now, the Royals and Twins, and you got the Cubs over in the NL Central, 5 of the 12 postseason spots. If the postseason were to begin today, nearly half of the postseason spots are coming out of those 2 Central divisions. It goes to show just how different baseball is right now and how much compression there is. Football talks about having that parity where from one year to the next, you get a new quarterback, immediately it's changed. Right now, baseball has that compression where there's so many teams in the middle right now that are quality. And in the American League Central, there's so much quality there. The real question is how much, and I don't know, I don't have the answer to this, how much are those teams winning because they're beating up on the Chicago White Sox? Now, that's not going to happen all year long because they're not playing 19 games against each other like they were 2 years and beyond that. So you can only do so much damage within your division. And there are also other really good teams that are there. The Tigers have even shown, signs of life here. They're only 1 game under 500. So, the AL Central has been really impressive. And I think we were all hoping for that because they have so many young players and because they were mildly aggressive, if you will, with signing free agents. It's nice to see that they're reaping the rewards of doing things in the traditionally right way.
When we came through this offseason, we talked about the Royals and the Tigers, but particularly right now, the Royals. If you had told them, like, yeah, you're going to be 7 games over 500 in the middle of May, they're feeling pretty good about themselves. They seem like a legit contender. And the Tigers, I still don't know if they're going to really have it in them to hang in this race. The Twins got off to a rough start, and they have gotten themselves right back into the mix. So I look at the Royals, and that's the team where it feels like they've arrived kind of a year early, but, man, everything is coming up KC right now to be able to plug in Seth Lugo, get this production out of him, to see Bobby Witt continue his ascension as an MVP candidate. it feels like they are going to really be able to hold on here, and good times ahead for the Royals. They might be buyers at this deadline, and they probably should be, right?
I think so. It's not a surprise in the same aspect of a young team coming up because they brought in so many veterans on short-term deals from the Seth Lugo, Michael Waka, Garrett Hampson. There's the list is too numerous. So I think you believe in these veterans playing as well as you would have expected. The only one that's been that superstar caliber is Bobby Witt Jr. And you'd seen that the previous 2 years. Salvatore Perez, we've seen that his entire career. So it's all the right boxes, I think, are being checked off. And you say, hey, this kind of makes sense. This is working. It's not a matter of, are they going to wake up one day and the floor is going to fall out from beneath them like it was with the Pittsburgh Pirates? They've got the right pieces in the right spots. And the math, I think, works out. They're going to be here until the end. This is their first time doing it with this group. So it'll be interesting to see how Bobby Witt Jr. reacts to that spotlight, like so many of the Orioles players and Adley Rutschman, responding to the spotlight. Pretty darn good. 4 homers in 2 days, a 2-home-run game, the first of his career, a walk-off homer on Wednesday. He had the postseason experience last year. He's ready to go. Now I think it's time for Bobby Witt Jr. and company to step up and for them to be in the spotlight and excel.
Yeah, when you get to that, August, really August in particular month, you get past the deadline, you're in the mix. You have a wild card spot. That's where you have to really kind of grow up as a team and prove like, all right, this is the time. Like every game counts throughout the season, but those games in August setting up for that final push, they really matter. And I think that's typically the month that can make or break teams, where if Kansas City kind of lets their foot off the gas there, they get tired. It is a long season, especially as a new ball club coming together. But I like their chances to definitely be in it by the time you get to the deadline and to maybe even sustain it all the way through. And I think the Twins and the Guardians are two teams that are typically atop this division and are good enough this year that we're not going to see them sell. We might see them selectively buy. Yankees, Orioles feel like all-in teams that will be maybe aggressive buyers at this deadline. The question then becomes all these teams below that right now. So let's look at the teams that are out of it. You have Red Sox, Rangers, Rays, Tigers that are all within 3.5 games of a playoff spot. And then you have Blue Jays, Astros that we'll talk about to close. But of those teams, Red Sox, Rangers, Rays, Tigers, which one do you see as the most aggressive buyer at the deadline? And which of those teams, if any, do you think is already going to maybe be thinking about, let's sell?
Aggressively buying, I think the money would have to go on the Texas Rangers because this is their time. They've already invested so much in the roster. They're hosting the All-Star game. That means a lot to these organizations and showing out in their ticket packages, things of that nature. So even if things were to get a little bit worse than getting swept by the worst team in the National League in the Colorado Rockies, which did just happen to them last week, and they're still been reeling from that. Nevertheless, I think the Rangers would still be, the most aggressive and say, this is our time. We're not necessarily worried as much about our future. So they could trade some of their top 10 prospects that are within their organization. And then the team that I think would be most inclined to sell off and to tap away, it's really I think a tie between the Red Sox and Tigers, and I think so much of that will have to do with the next couple months. But I'm almost tended to lean towards the Tigers, and I'm disappointed in my answer because I want a young team like that with the Spencer Torkelsons and the Riley Green and Kerry Carpenter and Tarek Skubal. I want teams like that to reap the rewards of that investment that they've made to these young players, similar to what we expect the Royals to have with them this summer. But I think the Tigers would be that one that they might be a little bit more aggressive, partially because it's just the way things are going for them and saying, we can add a little bit more so that 2025 is a little bit better for them.
You mentioned Skubal, and I think he is absolutely the interesting barometer on them because you might find it hard to believe, but yes, he just has ascended now. He's only got, he's about to enter, or he's in ARB. He's got a couple years left after this. He's got 25, 26 under team control, free agent in 2027. You put Scooble out there at the deadline this year, and it could be a franchise altering package you'd get back. But if you want to win next season, I mean, you finally found an ace. Like it just got here. Are you going to give up on it right away? So I would hope that the Tigers are buying or staying and trying to remain in the race when they get to 2025, and they're not doing that. But if they decided to hit that panic button, and in particular on that pitcher, I mean, there might not be a bigger trade package that is put forth this deadline than a package for Scooble.
There's one school of thought, and I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily enrolled in that school, that your best bet when you have a player of Tarek Scooble's caliber, right? Probably the front runner right now for the American League Cy Young Award, and he's got 2 years left of club control. So that's 2 more bites at the apple after this season, or that's 2 more years that another club can have him and therefore would pay more. That if you wait until the offseason, all 29 teams, in theory, are going to be in on that conversation of, wow, we could acquire Tarek Skubal. We're interested in that. You play one off one another and you get the best package possible. But I think that in many ways, if you do it at a trade deadline and a team is now 2 months closer to getting to the postseason and 3 months from winning a World Series, that might make that team a little bit more inclined to offload a prospect. Things ended up really well for the Chicago Cubs and the Cleveland Guardians at the time in 2016. Both of them traded a lot to acquire Aroldis Chapman and Andrew Miller, respectively. And yet they gave up those prospects. But as Casey Stern from MLB Network used to say all the time, prospects are cool, parades are cooler. Yeah. So I think if you were to dangle a guy like Tarek Skubal out there, you could have a team that really opens up the coffers even more so than if you were to wait in the offseason.
I think teams are getting so much smarter about how they make these decisions, that the rental doesn't quite get the same thing that I used to at the deadline. Because some teams just they realize, they're like, all right, I'm trading for 2 months and I'm gonna give up potentially 6-7 years of control on a top 100 prospect. It's just not a value proposition that they can buy into. You throw on 2 extra years and you're a GM and you say, not only do I have Skubal for this playoff run where I desperately need him, but I got 2 full seasons of him after this to build my rotation around. It's a conversation that you really got to talk about when it comes to what you're willing to give up. And you get a couple of those teams biting at that, it could be a move that you make. But again, if you're a Tigers fan and you finally feel like you have an ace, it's a shitty conversation to have.
For sure. We talked about it on the NL side with the Washington Nationals to see what they do. Could the Detroit Tigers be looking at the Washington Nationals and say, hey, you had this great player in Juan Soto, and boy, you were able to retool very quickly and become very good. Are the Tigers looking at the Nats going, you know what, maybe we can be Nats 2.0? So if Washington continues to have success, and even more so, that could be a helpful indicator, I think, in a way for the Tigers to do that. I think the Red Sox could be also aggressive too at this trade deadline. Craig Breslow in charge, kind of having an idea of what they wanted to do when they came in during the offseason, and a little bit of success. And maybe it's more than just a little bit to be, in this spot right now. 2 games out of the final wild card, 1 game over 500. Yes, that's quality success, but it's not overwhelming success. So you know what? Let's stick with our plan. You guys didn't convince us entirely that we need to be buying. So let's not ride the middle of the road. Let's make a choice, and we'll be selling. So I think it's close between the Tigers and Red Sox. And in many ways, I hope it is the Red Sox that are the more aggressive of the 2 teams.
Yeah, the Red Sox would have been the team I would have said initially, and I like that you mentioned the Tigers, because the more I'm thinking about it, I'm going, maybe they should hit that panic button and sell all those pieces that they can. But Red Sox definitely feel like a team that is more in a rebuild than in a window to contend, and one that should be getting the value that they can wherever they can. So we'll see. I mean, their pitching staff has been unbelievable. So if they continue to have the best rotation in baseball for even longer and their lineup meets them halfway, well, who knows? Maybe you just decide to play it out. The Rays are another interesting one where I could see them sell, but they started to play better baseball. I think they might just be in the race. Where if you had to bet right now, let's just say that it's, which horse you want to follow, the Rays, the Twins, or the Royals to sustain it over 162 and actually get in. I don't know what the odds are telling us right now, but I feel like the Rays, just based on their track record, still can be a team that eventually it ends up end of the season. Oh, Yankees, Orioles, Rays are in the playoffs. That's what we expected.
At the start of the season, I wouldn't have bet against the Rays, but with everything that I've seen and knowing that, look at the Moneyball A's, they didn't make the postseason every single year, right?
Yeah.
They had those seasons where it just didn't work. There are no guarantees with the way that you run an organization like the Rays, like almost how any team other than the Los Angeles Dodgers, it can be a somewhat of a crapshoot, but you're going with the odds, and more times than not, you will have that success. This could just be one of those years where the Rays don't have success, and I tend to think that that's true. It's just not their year, but it will be the year for the Royals or Twins.
Yep. And if it's not their year, Tampa's not going to miss the opportunity to get value. So that's what I will say. If they're not in the race, they will sell for sure. It's funny because I can't even say that about the Blue Jays, though. Like, I don't know if they will, but we already talked about them. The Astros, we've talked about on past shows. They're 6.5 out. They're playing a little bit better. Are the, like, as we're at the quarter mark, biggest disappointment, Astros, where are we at when we get through the first half of the season and get up to that deadline, almost 3/4 of the way through? Can they pull themselves out of this hole? And how far out of it would they have to be to sell?
Man, it would have to be really far out, because I think they will pull themselves out of it. It's a long season, and they haven't really had to grind in this way. They haven't had to worry about small mistakes, because hey, you're going to lose 3-4 games in a row over the course of the marathon that is the MLB season. But you're okay because you stockpiled the wins, right? They just haven't stockpiled those wins, so it's going to be harder and harder for them, to sustain relevance if they are losing. Now, they've won 4 games in a row at the time of this recording, so they're definitely heating up. And I think, again, as long as they're around 500, I think the front office is going to stand pat and say, I've got confidence in those guys. Like, as much as you might want to look at other rosters for teams that when it comes time that are a game or two out from the final wild card, or sitting there in 7th, 8th, 9th place, I think you'll look at both of those rosters and say, you know what, if team 7, 8, 9 adds a number 3 outfielder or a number 5 guy in the rotation, and you lay it all out, I think you'd still would lean towards the Astros, just because of the star power that they have, because of how successful they've been late in seasons, how successful they've been in October. So it's not the way you would really draw it up, but in the grand scheme of things, they could be trending in a much better direction rather than playing poorly for the final month. They're just going to have to play really well for that final month. And if they do that, I think they're still going to be able to sneak into the postseason. I'm not that concerned about them. Disappointed for sure, but I am not out on the Astros. Not yet.
It's a team that if they get in there, no matter what they've looked like, let's just say their run differential is minus 60 and they sneak in with 87 wins. Whoever they see in that first round of the playoffs is going to fear them. And it's the same thing for however many rounds they win, because they have the track record that no other team in baseball has in October. And our boy Kyle Tucker, after we talked about last week, guess what? He's leading Major League Baseball in home runs. So look, they got the pieces. No one wants to face Jordan and Altuve and Tucker in a playoff series, and especially when they still have some good starting pitchers when they're completely healthy. It's interesting. I feel like I don't buy into this Astros team being able to dig themselves out of this hole, because I look at, if we think the Royals are going to make the playoffs, we know the Orioles are going to. Well, now you got Astros, Rangers, all these other teams vying for that one spot. Twins. We'll see. Like, I think I believe in the Rangers more than the Astros, but I don't know if either of them is selling at the deadline. I think both of them will probably be enough in the mix that they're gonna hold on to it and let the final month play out. So we'll see how the chips fall. The A's, sellers, right? No matter how good it looks in the first half.
Not literally, because John,
Oh
they're
yeah,
keeping the
yeah,
team. No, I
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
They're not
No,
going to
you're
sell
right.
the team. They're going to sell the
They're
assets,
gonna
which
they're they're gonna sell everything but what we want them to. Yes, yeah. So
touche.
and then you got are the Angels gonna sell this year, and do they have anything to sell? Because the White Sox are gonna sell whatever they can, whatever's not bolted down. They're selling it, but the Angels, like, how delusional are they to think? And I guess what do they have to deal? But there's got to be some pitching they can move.
Yeah, we're talking about the AL West. So the Back It Up Binge podcast, we're not going to be talking about the Mariners because we're talking about teams that are selling, not buying, which the Mariners absolutely will be
Yeah,
this year. But the Angels, look, they brought in Ron Washington, and he's a winning manager. He has a winning pedigree. He wants to win. And from some of the managers that I've talked with over the years, so many of them have that old school nature, which maybe isn't even that old school. You want to win with the players that you have, and you don't have control over who's coming and who's going. But if you had a choice, you would want everybody to stay so you have the best chance to win. No field manager is looking at their lineup saying, hey, if we trade this guy, we can bring up a prospect. Well, that makes my job even harder to win ball games. So Ron Washington does not want Perry Manassian to trade anybody away. He doesn't want the Angels to make any of those deals. So it's a tough situation to be in, especially in the season after Ohtani. They're in a tough spot. They don't have a ton of guys to offload. They would have to really get creative, which I don't know that they're necessarily going to be able to do. So they're probably in the worst spot. And Angels fans, look, there are teams that have been really bad this year, but their heart was ripped out when they lost Ohtani. Mike Trout being hurt, might not be back for the entirety of this season. They don't even have anything exciting really to deal at the deadline, as you said there. So Angels fans really going through it right now.
If I had to pick, if I was in the market to be a GM, and I am, by the way, if anyone wants to call me up, I'd love to make some moves. But if I had to by pick of a litter, I could take any team in baseball, and I had to start Xing them off. I think the Angels are the first team that I'm crossing off and saying, no way do I want that job. Because at least with the White Sox, they've started the process. Like, yes, they're worse this year, but they are squarely in. We're selling everything we can. We signed Tommy Pham because we got at bats to give, and guess what? We will get a nice little prospect for him at the deadline because he's performing. The Angels, they kind of tried to go for it this year. They made a couple of reliever signings, but they're not committed to rebuilding. If they were, they would have taken Mike Trout this offseason, had an honest conversation, and said, look, let's go shop you and get you to a situation for the rest of your career where you can get a chance to win. And they would have started over, but they didn't. And now it's even harder to even envision them taking their one viable trade asset that could spark a rebuild. It's now another year of Trout getting hurt. There's even less value there whenever you do circle back around to that conversation. So I just think they have been run horribly. And
That's what
I
happens when your owner is acting like your GM, or
yeah,
at least in just injecting himself around the baseball people, right? When you're the owner, you can do those things, and that's absolutely, you're right. But there's a difference between the business side and the baseball side. And if you let the baseball people run the baseball side of things, that can very much be good for business. But if as soon as you start bumping in there and saying, here's what I think should happen, you're too many cooks in the kitchen, and it's the wrong cook.
yeah, no, it is for sure. And they're just in a bad place, and you feel bad for the fan base because those rebuilds, and they take a lot out of you, and it's years of waiting for your team to reach a level of relevance again. I think that about wraps up all the different teams that we're looking at here as far as buying, selling, who's in the middle at the quarter mark of the season here. Any last kind of overall takeaways with what we've seen in Major League Baseball? How do you think this season is going to end up finishing up, as far as, is this going to be a crazy race like last year? Do we like this format? As I guess the bigger thing I'm trying to get at. Do we like the 3 wild card teams? Everyone's in it, or do you miss at all the the competition for those 2 spots? Because I think overall it brought more great teams to the playoffs than now, where it's a lot of kind of meh that still gets in there.
I think this will be just as exciting of a trade deadline as it typically is, and we touched on some of the names, right, with Pete Alonso, Alex Bregman, which we talked about. Go back and listen to that episode. It still has plenty of meat on the bones and relevance. Ryan McMahon for the Rockies, right? Is he going to be one of those players that gets offload if the Rockies are aggressive? But I think what makes this year's trade deadline possibly so interesting is I don't think we know who's going to be dealing what. Just like the Luis Arias trade kind of coming out of nowhere, you now have these players that you don't normally see. You've got the Royals that are in there, and still the Orioles, who are still new to the game. They're still, relatively new kids on the block. And then you've got the St. Louis Cardinals as a team that could be offloading and making trades, and maybe even the Rockies too, whether or not you think their players are exciting or not. Look, they made 5 deals last trade deadline. Maybe they'll do it again. I think teams now, because there are more clubs that get into the postseason, it's requiring everybody to be a bit more creative. So there might not be as big of names as we have seen in the past, though I'd argue they're still just as big. Sure, I don't think there are those superstar teams maybe getting into the postseason. I think it's just that they're not having the same typical run throughout the postseason as we normally see. So having that creativity, I think is what's making the trade deadline just as interesting as when there was only 2 divisions and 2 teams that made it from each league, or 3 or 4 or 5. 6, I think, is still good for business.
It's good to keep fan bases engaged and to keep hope alive for so long, because it's just very hard almost to fall out of the race. I mean, look, there's 4 teams that are out of it right now, really, if you look at it. So I think there is part of me that says it's not great for the game, because I think it actually takes away a bit from the deadline, because there's teams that just they get caught in between and they just do nothing. And I like to see teams go one way or the other, and you want to see the star players moving around. But we're a quarter of the way through. A lot's going to change in the next 60 some odd games till we get to the deadline, and I am looking forward to it. We will be back for more editions of Who's Better Baseball, breaking down all of the best in the game. We'll have another show on Sunday talking about all of the latest, so make sure you check that out. If you're watching the live stream, make sure you head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. We'll be breaking this up into smaller videos. So if you missed the front end of the podcast, you can catch that. You can find our audio feed, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. You can listen to the show that way. You can find us on Twitter or X at Who's Better BB. I took it from you, Patrick. I announced it as well, because last week, I mean, you were talking about who's better, BB baby, and I couldn't let misinformation get out there. So, like I said, we will be back for another show on Sunday.